Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Understanding Disproportionality webinar. During today's session, we will be discussing the topic using beliefs, policies, and practices to address disproportionality. And for those of you who tried to join us for the previously scheduled webinar on this topic, thank you very much for your patience, and thank you so much for coming back. I am Heather Ngoma, and I am the New Jersey State Coordinator for REL Mid-Atlantic, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Joining me is my co-host from the New Jersey Department of Education, Dr. Laura Marana, who is the Interim Executive County Superintendent for Middlesex and Mercer Counties, and our presenter, Dr. Maria Hernandez, Associate Director for Training and Development from the NYU Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. And before we advance with the agenda, I would like to point out ways to communicate with the webinar team and with each other. In the top right bar, there is a parking lot where you can post questions about the webinar content. And in the bottom right is an area where you can ask for help with technical issues. And we will start today's session with an overview of REL Mid-Atlantic, followed by a brief discussion of the collaboration between REL Mid-Atlantic, the New Jersey Department of Education, and the NYU Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. We will then hear from Maria Hernandez during the presentation segment, take questions during the Q&A period, and then finally wrap up. So let's hear a little about REL Mid-Atlantic. For those of you who did not attend our last webinar, REL Mid-Atlantic is one of 10 regional educational laboratories throughout the nation. We are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. Our particular service region includes New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. For those of you who are participating from states that I did not mention, I want to point out that you do have a regional educational laboratory that serves you in your region. REL Mid-Atlantic provides no-cost direct research services and technical assistance support to education stakeholders throughout our service region. All of our services emphasize research and data use. Direct research services include descriptive studies, policy scans, literature reviews, research syntheses, and rigorous studies. Our data-focused technical assistance products and services range from trainings, workshops, and webinars to white papers and how-to guides. So now that you know a little about REL Mid-Atlantic, I'd like to turn things over to Laura Marana, who will move us along to the goals of this webinar series and then introduce our presenter, Maria Hernandez. Laura?
Good morning. Thank you, Heather, and thank you to all of you for your interest in the webinar series designed to enhance our toolbox as we explore equity and disproportionality beyond typical data and information about the status of student achievement and about the gaps in achievement among students in our individual schools and individual school districts. As some of you might recall, and Heather referenced this earlier, the session held on March 4th, for example, featured Dr. Vogaridis, who set the stage for amazing presentations on understanding disproportionality. And one of the things that you will see is that we posted a link so you can have access to that wonderful foundation that was set a couple of weeks ago. I certainly would love to take a minute to acknowledge the, not only call it thoughtful, creative, and meaningful contributions of staff members at REL and the Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality at NYU to this webinar series. It is only with their remarkable and ongoing support that we and you and all of us as educators will be able to gain a deeper understanding of educational equity and disproportionality. I'm just so very appreciative, and on behalf of all of us, I thank REL and NYU for contributing to the professional learning of our educators and the success of our students. So our partnership is so incredibly important and so incredibly appreciated by all of us. So thank you once again. So moving right along, one of the things that you will find and you will see today is that the conversation on equity and understanding of equity will continue through an examination, I am going to say, of not only the use of data, the collection and also analysis of data, but also looking at root causes, as you can see on the slide, analyzing existing policies and practices to address disproportionality, which is probably one of those very critical areas that continues to demand and require a great deal of attention, but also a great deal of focused work on everyone's part. And also looking at the research and sort of knowledge base on the cultural competence and equity that will further enhance the toolbox, as I said earlier, in such a way that we will be equipped not only to engage and lead and further the conversation, I would say, back at the school, classroom, and district level as well. So I'm just thrilled to be part of this conversation. So looking ahead, one of the things that we have, I apologize, I'm just moving this along. Okay. One of the things that you will see actually today, too, is an introduction to the upcoming webinars. And not only will the conversation continue with key activities to reflect on biases for addressing disproportionality. And then later on April 22nd, this is a session that will be scheduled. We will have practitioners. You will hear from those out in the field who are not only maximizing the learning opportunities through REL and NYU, but also they're leading the tough conversation, I am going to say, at the district level, and they are doing it in a highly, highly effective and successful way. So we are thrilled. And with that in mind, and moving right along, we are going to kick off today's webinar with Dr. Maria Hernandez. And I'm just so thrilled, as you might recall, we missed her presentation, but it was rescheduled for today, and she's feeling rather well today. Dr. Maria Hernandez, let me share with you a little bit about what I've learned about her. Not only does she have practical teaching experience as well as extensive experience working with recently arrived immigrant Latino children and families, including the coordination of various elementary school programs, extended summer learning, programs for English language learners, creating partnerships between schools, communities, and families, and working with families of young children with developmental delays. Certainly her research interests focus on how social, cultural, and contextual factors and family separations related to immigration shape identity by fascinating mental health and educational outcomes for newcomer immigrants, Latino children and adolescents as well. She teaches program evaluation at NYU. With that quick and brief introduction, I mean, clearly we are so looking forward to her presentation today. And with that, I will basically turn it over to you, Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Heather. And thank you, Real Mid-Atlantic, for providing us as a Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. We've been doing throughout New York State, specifically how we use belief policies and practices to address disproportionality. So I'm so excited to be here with you today. So the first thing I want to share with you is who is the Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. We are actually situated at the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at New York University. We are actually funded by the New York State Department of Education, and our work currently entails working with 20 districts throughout New York State who've been cited for disproportionality. So what that means is that New York State, like other states throughout the nation, will cite districts who have been overclassifying specific racial and ethnic groups into special education, and then as such suspending children who have IEPs. So our entry point is through special education, and oftentimes the work that we do with districts is targeting general education because disproportionality is not necessarily a special education issue. It's just our entry point. So part of the work entails within these 20 districts throughout the state is that we provide both professional development and technical assistance work to support districts in creating systems that are equitable and culturally responsive so that all of our children can be successful. We do at the forefront require our districts to commit with us for about 2 years, but we do have districts currently that we've been working with for more than 2 years. The other element that we also do as part of our work is we provide regional professional development throughout New York State. So what that means is that districts in different regions throughout New York State who have either been cited for disproportionality and who we are not working with, or who are at risk for being cited for disproportionality, we work with them through our regional trainees that oftentimes entail 4 different regional trainees in a particular area, foci area, that we coordinate with our partners in the region to specifically have conversations related to disproportionality, but align with us in a way that we're able to first identify in those particular regions what is contributing to their disproportionality. We then embed content specifically to that target area, and then we further leave those particular participating regional districts with identifying action steps that they can take back into their particular district. So what I want to make sure we know that today, what I'm going to be able to provide is really an overview of the role that police policies and practices have in disproportionality. So oftentimes what we've come to understand that police policies and practices are actually causes to disproportionality, but they are actually also solutions in being able to remedy disproportionality. So part of our conversation will really be able to have a conversation about how is it that we are able to examine the roles that police policies and practices have in causing disproportionality, but in what ways can those same police policies and practices be targeted as solutions to specifically address disproportionality. Part of our work oftentimes entails specifically when we think about disproportionality oftentimes really impacts particular children and our particular sets of students within our districts and our schools. Overall, we have to be able to discuss this elephant in the room, and what that means that oftentimes males, students of color, specifically Black and Latino students, and our students who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, our LGBTQ youth, and our students who have IEPs are the ones that are mostly impacted negatively by disproportionality. So to be able to remedy disproportionality, we always have to make sure that we're able to have this discussion on who disproportionality impacts the most. And specifically, when we begin to kind of think about disparate outcomes, it's the same children that I just noted that oftentimes will fall through the cracks if we're not really able to address disproportionality and begin to create systems that are equitable and culture responsive to the diversity of students we have within our districts, but within our schools as well. And part of our work entails that all of us as practitioners in our educational system, we experience these 3 core tensions. And I like to talk about these 3 core tensions mainly because to be able to identify police policies and practices that are contributing to disproportionality, but also ways that they could create the solution to disproportionality, we have to be clear on these particular 3 core tensions that all practitioners do experience within our educational system. So oftentimes these 3 core tensions focus on a personal, structural, and strategy tension. The personal tension often is one that we're always asking ourselves, if I'm a person, a type of practitioner who's in the educational system, who's ready to have a conversation about race and racism in terms of how it may play out within our educational systems. In a similar light, the structural tension that we experience is, are we individuals who are ready to counteract structural and societal problems specifically related to racial and race-class inequities that play out within our educational system? So oftentimes what that becomes is, you know what, I'm a teacher and all I can do is really manage what occurs in a classroom. This is really a district issue, and it's a district issue that needs to be addressed. So the structural tension is really oftentimes kind of navigating, okay, what do I really have control over? And at the same time, acknowledging that there are certain things that we may perceive that we don't necessarily have control over because it's really bigger than us. Our strategy tension is oftentimes being able to identify, and we're searching for concrete, actionable steps that we could immediately take to a school or a classroom to be able to address racial inequities, to be able to support all of our students. But oftentimes our strategies, and I oftentimes will hear from many practitioners I work with, you know, give me that strategy. If you tell me what it is, I'll run with it. And I want to acknowledge that the strategies or practices are significant for us to be able to shift disproportionality. But because I noted that our beliefs actually shape how we practice at points in time, I can hand out the strategies and recognize that the strategies may not be implemented as intended or with a level of fidelity. So when we support districts within these particular tensions, what we're laying out is that the practices oftentimes will derive from the individuals who are in the room that are more meaningful specifically to the districts and schools we work within, but as such, where we've actually gone through the process of really understanding within the particular districts and schools what is specifically contributing to disproportionality, so we could then identify practices that would be more useful for that particular district and those particular schools. So what I want us to start out with is specifically all of us being clear on what disproportionality is. So disproportionality includes really an overrepresentation of particular groups, specifically racial and ethnic groups, in particular educational outcomes in relation to the presence of those particular groups in the overall student population. So those educational outcomes oftentimes will include special education. They will include disciplinary outcomes. And so what that really means that, for example, if you have a district that is maybe 20% Black, that is the overall student population. But those particular students who are within that district are being affected by the disciplinary system at 60%. That is disproportionate because those numbers should equate. What I mean with that is that if 20% of the children in a district are Black, that means that only 20% should be impacted by the disciplinary system. In a similar light, disproportionality is also an underrepresentation of particular groups, specifically racial and ethnic groups, in a particular educational outcome in relation to the overall student population. So what that really translates into is that it's oftentimes when we might have an underrepresentation of racial and ethnic groups in gifted and talented programs in AP and honors courses. So again, given the analogy of a district having 20% of students who may be Black, and perhaps if we look at our actual AP and honors courses, that only 2% of students who are Black are reflected in those AP and honors courses. So what I want to highlight is that it's important for us to note that disproportionality is very complex and that multiple factors actually contribute to disproportionality. So as such, even these particular factors that I've laid out that I'm about to discuss cause disproportionality. they also are ones in ways that we could begin to remedy disproportionality as well. So what oftentimes may have happened within our districts and our schools, as it's happened nationwide, is that many of our districts and schools have seen social demographic shifts in the past 10, 15 years. For some of our districts, even in the past 5 years. And so as such, what oftentimes happens when we have social demographic shifts, specifically in districts where perhaps we've had predominantly white students, and as such, we've also had predominantly white faculty and staff, is that we begin to see more students of color entering our actual school districts or our schools. But at the same time, the social demographics of who is in our faculty and staff hasn't necessarily shifted. And so as such, that will contribute to disproportionality, because then the other layer to that is then the level of cultural dissonance that oftentimes may happen when we have new different social demographics entering our school district. So we might not necessarily know a whole lot about our new students who are coming into our school districts and schools. And then at the same time, simultaneously, we still have our similar faculty and staff existing in those particular schools. So when we don't understand who's coming into our schools, we experience a level of cultural dissonance, which then really leads to particular sets of misconceptions that we may have about children who come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, and mainly because we really don't know a whole lot about who some of the children who are entering our school really are, which then oftentimes will lead to levels of teacher expectations, particular sets of expectations that we have for Black and Latino children, and based on particular sets of misconceptions that we have about them. So which leads to the component in a similar light. What role does family community play? How is it that we engage our family and communities who are different than we are in those particular school settings? So at the core, when these pieces are not ones that we're actually taking a proactive stance in addressing, we will have disproportionality. In a similar light, some of our discipline policies and practices will lead to disproportionality. And what I mean with that is that our discipline policies and practices are really oftentimes set up in a way to ensure that everybody in our districts and schools are safe. And that's really, we want to make sure it's a safe environment so all stakeholders feel that they could be successful in those particular contexts. Oftentimes when we begin to look a little bit closer at our discipline policies, we begin to note that particular children are being touched more frequently by our discipline policies. But the other component that goes with that is that despite the fact that we may have a policy in place on how we render discipline, the practices may not fully be aligning with those policies that we've actually put in place. So in a similar light, with our interventions that we have in place, whether it is our Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 interventions that we have to support our students academically and behaviorally, if we have interventions that are stronger at Tier 3, for example, sometimes it's easier to provide the Tier 3 interventions. And if we note that those Tier 3 interventions are not succeeding, specifically with our children who are struggling academically, that oftentimes automatically becomes that gateway into special education, specifically when Tier 1 isn't as strong or Tier 2 isn't as strong for our children. The other layer that will contribute to disproportionality is instruction. Instruction being is that if instruction is not rigorous, if the expectations are not set for our children to succeed, there are particular children who are not necessarily going to succeed in our classroom setting, and then as such is going to lead to disproportionality, which then brings us to the core of why we do what we do. We want to make sure that we're providing true educational opportunity for all our kids. But when we have these multiple factors intersecting with each other, we don't have true educational opportunities for all of our children. So when true educational opportunity is not accessible to all of our children, it does lead to disproportionality. So what I want us to be able to be clear on as well is that Our policies is what really guides what we do in our districts and our schools on a day-to-day basis. We have policies in place so that we've created parameters and guidelines on how we operate in districts and schools. Our practices are actually how are we executing those particular guidelines that have been laid out for us. And what specific activities do we do to execute those particular guidelines? And our beliefs rely on what specific sets of ideals do our individuals who exist within our schools, our school personnel engage implementing those specific practices and policies. So these particular policies, beliefs, and practices oftentimes are ones that will cause disproportionality or are also solutions to disproportionality. So what that oftentimes entails is that these components of beliefs, policies, and practices will actually interact and they will manifest themselves in numerous ways within our schools. So as we begin to kind of think about more of the ways that beliefs, policies, and practices can address disproportionality, I noted that beliefs in particular are those ideals that we hold. And as we enter schools, our beliefs always come with us. But in a similar light, we noted that our policies are those guidelines that allow us to understand what is it that we do in our schools on a day-to-day basis, and the practice is how we do it. And to be able to begin to identify solutions to disproportionality, some of the core things we target as the Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality is we begin to support our schools and districts on beginning to develop a cultural responsive framework. So the process that we will go through with the district when we begin to work with them in year one is we will support our district in going through a root cause process where they themselves will identify what is the specific root cause in their particular district that is leading to disproportionality. So that oftentimes is year one work for us with our districts. Year two work oftentimes begins in supporting districts, in really identifying and really creating capacity in developing a culture responsive framework. So we have noted that by developing a multicultural lens among our practitioners, then we are able to create ongoing systemic practice and policy changes in our schools that are responsive to all of our children. So the core concepts that we will focus on in our culture responsive framework rely on everybody having a clear understanding of what culture is. Race and identity, the role that power and privilege plays in our practice, but also in the ways that we create our policy, the role that vulnerability plays, stereotypes of threat plays, but also the role of microaggressions. So what that oftentimes looks like is we've laid out our curriculum to target beliefs in 4 stages, but now it's a 5th stage. That is, the first strand really focuses on everybody developing a clear and common language what CRE is, but also in that process really beginning to recognize institutional and organizational structures in schools that are really perpetuating those particular inequities. So the first strand really ensures that everybody has a clear understanding. What is cultural responsiveness? And then as such, how is it that cultural responsiveness and not being cultural responsive really contributes to our inequities within our districts and our schools? Because strand 2, then I oftentimes say, is really the harder lifting work, where we begin to do more of the reflective pieces among our participants. So what that really means is that our participants go through the process of really beginning to understand how is it that race and power of the individuals who are within our schools really shape their practice. So this becomes more of a self-assessment, and under the notion that we bring ourselves, we bring our biases into our work. but we need to be able to be reflective on those pieces of our biases that we bring into our work, and that includes our identity, that includes our own racial experiences that we've had, and it further also includes our power and privilege. Because by strand 3, what we're really trying to do is still engage in our conversation that is self-reflective, but we begin to kind of see what role does racial and ethnic identity of our students specifically begin to impact their performance in school. So oftentimes, some of the core concepts we're relying on here is really looking a little bit closer at the role that race and identity has for our practitioners, but also our students and our families, but also where vulnerability, what role vulnerability has in impacting our students and our families. And what that really means is that oftentimes some of our students do come from a more vulnerable space. And we have to assess, when we have students who are more vulnerable in nature, how is it that we as practitioners within our schools could create more protective spaces for our children so that they're set up to succeed despite the vulnerability, which then oftentimes leads to our conversations related to microaggressions. And the conversation about microaggressions is really understanding how microaggressions occur on a day-to-day basis, but the implications that it specifically has for our students of color and the impact it has in their performance in a similar light, the role the stereotype threat has and the impact it has for performance as well. Because by strand 4, what we're trying to then do is really begin to identify and developing an action plan that aims to really begin to produce more equitable student outcomes specifically. So what we oftentimes will do by this point that we will make sure that our schools and districts walk out with something that is actionable, specifically related to how they're going to begin to embed cultural responsiveness in the work that they do, specifically within the district, but also schools. And so what that sometimes entails is our next steps that we take with schools and districts, which we refer to our CRE practices. We will oftentimes find that our districts and our schools will share with us how is it that we do this. We still need coaching. We still need support. So the latter part really begins to provide coaching opportunities on cultural responsiveness with key people within our district, but also our schools. So what that means is we will build capacity among building leaders, for example, on doing more of a cultural responsive walkthrough. So what that means is that we will go with building leaders in their schools and actually show them what are you looking for in a classroom, what are you looking for in a building that will let you know that what you're doing at your school is being responsive to all of our children. The other component that we will support our schools and districts with is looking at their data, but also supporting them in creating data systems that allow them to consistently look at data, but also look at data in a disaggregated way by subgroups, specifically always looking at race, looking at students who have an IEP or ENL students by gender, so that as such, that data could inform decision-making in a way that is supportive to our most vulnerable students. But in a similar light, having conversations, we also have conversations with data people within the district to share with them the specific tools that we use to identify whether you have disproportionality or you don't have disproportionality in who's being affected mostly by disproportionality, whether it is related to performance, achievement, or whether it is related specifically to discipline or overclassification of particular racial and ethnic groups. The other layer that we include in these practices also entails doing an inventory assessment of the curriculum that districts are currently implementing. That is the curriculum responsive to who our students are? In a similar light, problem-solving teams. We support our districts through technical assistance work in creating problem-solving teams that really address a level of cultural responsiveness and really keep conversations that are significant for our children to succeed on the table. So one of the components that we're going to walk you through right now is there is actually, you should actually see a screen that says Pick 2. So what we would like you to do right now, because I want you to experience how we do our work. What I would like you to do right now, I would like you to pick 2 of the specific common terms that we actually use in the work on cultural responsiveness and just define what these terms mean to you. So the first thing, when you see the word race, when you see the word class, when you see the word access, fairness, equity, and opportunity, and equality, write a brief definition of what these particular words mean to you. First thing that comes to your mind. So we'll give it about 30 more seconds. thank you, everybody, for your fantastic responses. I knew we had some brilliant people on this webinar because many of you are really on point, absolutely on point in terms of defining these different terms that we use to create a cultural responsive lens. So we will have our participants actually define these terms, but also identify ways that they exist within their school districts and schools and the ways that they don't exist within their school districts and schools, specifically because a cultural responsive lens really entails race, it entails class, culture, access, fairness, equity, opportunity, and equality as well. So when we begin to think about equality, we consider that equality is what we actually do in districts and schools, that everybody gets the same. When everybody gets the same, the underlying assumption is that all will succeed. However, but what we do know is that sometimes we have children who need more to actually be successful. And so equity is really about knowing that we're going to have kids who are actually going to need more and families who are going to need more to be successful. So equity is getting what you need to be successful. And for our kids to be able to reach their full potential, equity is what it is that they're actually going to need. And it relies on this notion that we are providing true access to particular education opportunities that we're offering our children. In a similar light, we rely on these concepts of both opportunity and access. An opportunity being that we all have a chance, that everybody has a chance. But to be able to fully execute opportunity, we need access. Access is what gives us the path to that opportunity. And fairness, fairness oftentimes is an area that I think is really a hard one, and we struggle with what is fair and what isn't fair. But fairness at a fundamental level is just a chance of getting what we want in life. So does fairness necessarily mean that we get the same thing? No, not necessarily. To be able to reach equity, we need fairness. So we reach equity through fairness. So when we see this particular picture, what we first note is that equality, all the children are receiving the same. That is, the goal here is to just see the baseball game. As such, we see a child who is vertically challenged, and so as such, he's not able to see the game. He needs a little bit more to be able to see the game. So he's going to need another block to be able to see the game. So if we were equitable, we would give the child who actually doesn't have what he needs to see the game, so now that he can actually see the game. So oftentimes what this really entails is that to be equitable and to have educational equity, we have to be able to alter our practices and our perspectives, specifically to create social transformation and be able to create equitable learning outcomes for all of our students, and so that everybody is able to get what they actually need. The other layer that we oftentimes add to this is really understanding what race is. In America specifically, oftentimes all of us struggle with having a conversation about race. But specifically, we struggle with the conversation about race oftentimes because we may feel that if we have a conversation about race, if we say race, others might think that we're being racist. But to be able to really address disproportionality, we have to be able to put race on the table. And that oftentimes entails knowing that it's going to be a difficult conversation, but since disproportionality is a racialized outcome, we need to be able to have that courageous conversation. So we always want to make sure that everybody clearly understands that race is really socially constructed, and it really groups individuals, a particular group of people, based on physical characteristics that include their skin color, hair, and facial features. However, even as we define this social constructed category in that process, as we engage in conversations, we have to be able to acknowledge and recognize that race plays out in particular ways in the United States, and it plays out in particular ways in our educational system. In a similar light, when we begin to think about ethnicity, it includes a membership of groups who have a common geographic origin, history, culture, language, or religion. And oftentimes that membership of ethnic groups is conscious that they belong to a particular ethnic group, and that ethnicity is further marked by that they're recognized by others. That is, that it's a particular group distinctiveness. These components of understanding these components become significant because we may have children and families within our schools who are a particular racial group, but their ethnicity may actually be different. And so what I mean with that is we may have children who are black in our school district, but their ethnicity might actually be African American, might be Dominican, might be Haitian. And it becomes important for us to be able to distinguish these in particular, because when we get to looking at who our demographics are within our districts and schools, and we look at our data, I will oftentimes hear, oh, well, 80% of our students are black. I'm like, yeah, okay. But what about if we look a little bit further? What is the ethnicity of our children who are black? Because then it's able to give us a greater picture of understanding, specifically with disproportionality, of who is being affected the most by disproportionality, despite the fact that a district or a school might be 80% fact, that there is greater complexity beyond race, that we have to look at ethnicity as well. The other component that we all have to have a clear understanding of is what social class is. And when we think about social class, it really refers to a group of people with similar levels of wealth, influence, and status. But social class also manifests itself in a particular way within our society, and we use particular language when we think about social class as well. So we define what a middle class is. We define what a lower socioeconomic class is. But there are particular key words that go with social class that we want to make sure that everybody has a clear understanding of. So when we do our culture responsive work, the first thing that we want to make sure is that people have a clear understanding of this common language that really plays out in our schools. So even as we think about the role of equity in our discipline, or if we think about the ways that our kids are provided access to AP and honors courses, because we can say that our kids have an opportunity into our AP and honors courses, but some of our kids don't necessarily have access to AP and honors courses, for example. Which brings us to our more complex aspect of this common language that we use, which is really culture. And culture is what we do on a day-to-day basis, and sometimes we don't even know that we're actually doing culture. And it really entails us having shared behaviors, beliefs, customs, and values that really guide what it is that we do every single day. And culture is really transmitted generationally, but oftentimes we don't necessarily want to confound culture with race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity is part of culture, but they don't necessarily equal each other. Culture is more complex in its own right. Why is culture important, though? When we think about how we learn as people, how we remember, how we solve problems, how we communicate, culture plays a role. But it plays a role in our students. It's specifically our students' development, social development, how it is that they communicate with us, how it is that they actually problem solve. And when we really begin to embrace differences within our district and schools, the role that culture really plays is that culture aims to really support its people and not necessarily destroy its people. Because culture is complex. So if we rely on this idea of above the water culture, it's really surface culture, right? When we think about particular cultural groups, we usually are able to associate those particular cultural groups with maybe food, dress, a dance, language, or music. However, if we begin to look a little bit below that waterline, we begin to notice specific unspoken rules of culture. This is one where oftentimes as a culture observer, we have to be a little bit more alert. That is that we're not necessarily going to be able to see these aspects of culture that are really playing out among different groups of people. So for example, even eye contact. Oftentimes in a U.S. context, giving eye contact demonstrates respect. For other cultural groups, giving eye contact to an adult in particular is disrespectful. And so as we think about these pieces of what's below the waterline and how it plays out within our schools, for our children, for our families that are different than we are, we have to be cognizant in recognizing that sometimes it is culture that is actually playing itself out. And as such, we have to identify ways where we become a little bit more cultural savvy, or we recognize that culture does play a role in the execution of behaviors. But furthermore, when we get more deeper into culture, these are aspects of culture that we are not able to really articulate, but rather they happen, and they just kind of occur, but we don't even know that they're happening because we live these aspects of culture on a day-to-day basis. Specifically, when I think about the conception of the self, in a U.S. context, specifically there is a stress to have an individual conception of the self, because the individual conception of the self then can prospectively translate into autonomy and then independence. However, in other cultural contexts, more of a conception of a self that relies on interdependence might be more important. And interdependence really being that we rely on others, family members, to be able to execute our sense of self, which what it translates into is that actually existing further for a longer period of time within a family context is normative. However, when we kind of look at what happens in schools, a lot of what we sometimes do in schools, specifically when we're teaching kids, we want them to be able to do some independent work. But then we have kids who may more oftentimes rely to be able to learn in particular contexts. They need the group interaction. They need those interactions that are more interdependent on others to be able to acquire the learning that they need. So what this really means for us then, what does a culture responsive practice ultimately look like? It is reflective in nature. And part of this process entails being reflective, but it also entails beginning to really develop a critical social consciousness along with cultural competency about race, power, and privilege within our society. But in that process, really being able to challenge deficit-oriented beliefs and approaches in how we educate our students. And how we do this is we challenge it through systems, policies, and people, because we ultimately want to be able to develop a cultural responsive lens to respond to all of our students. So what that oftentimes really entails is that we understand that for our students to really be able to succeed in our academic settings, that cultural, language, and heritage experiences need to be valued and really used to facilitate their learning and development, and really be able to provide access to high-quality teachers, programs, and resources. So what that means is that in the process, we have to be able to embrace all differences, have high expectations for all of our students, and execute those high expectations, but realize that despite the fact that some of our students may come from more vulnerable spaces, that schools serve such a significant role in creating that protection for our kids. So this is one way, what I walked you through right now is one way that we actually target beliefs, and recognizing that when we target beliefs, that it is a journey for everybody. It all depends, it's so dependent upon where individuals are in that continuum in their own assessment of where they are going to be culture responsive. And the journey is ongoing. And then it becomes, how is it that then within schools and our school districts we continue these particular conversations, because these particular conversations are the ones that are really oftentimes shaping how we think about differences, how we manage the differences that our children and families bring to school. So then it really entails then realizing that to have a culture responsive lens is that we recognize the importance of valuing and honor students, families, and cultural references in all aspects of learning. And it is then through this cultural responsive lens that we continue to develop our policies and our practices, which then brings us to the other layer. So how is it that then we begin to look a little bit more closer at our policies to develop solutions to disproportionality? So one piece that we will execute with our districts as we're going through the root cause process is we have them analyze their student code of conduct. And so what that oftentimes really entails is we provide these particular guiding questions for districts to kind of assess their student code of conduct. So oftentimes we want them to identify what is it that they like, what is it that they don't like. But we also want them to identify what is the purpose of our student code of conduct, how does our school actually use it, and how are our teachers using it, how are our administrators using it, and how was it created, how do we distribute our student code of conduct, how does the school ensure that all members have the same understanding of the code of conduct. And that's the important piece that then translates into the practice. So if we all don't have a clear understanding of the student code of conduct, the language in the student code of conduct, we're going to rely on what we think it is. And then as such, it's going to translate in our actual practice. In a similar light, does our student code of conduct have ambiguous language that is open to interpretation? So oftentimes what we may see in student code of conduct, we see the language of disrespect, insubordination, disruptive behavior that has not been clearly defined. And it becomes a slippery slope when we haven't defined what disrespectful behavior is, what insubordination is, because we're going to apply our own lens of what that is to decipher what insubordination actually looks like or what it really feels like. The other layer we want districts to do in this process is identify which students are mostly impacted by the student code of conduct. And does the student code of conduct, is it fair, is it equitable, or is it just simply equal? In a similar light, what we will also do through this process is have districts assess their current discipline form. And it relies on similar questions, specifically, why does the form actually exist? What is the purpose of the form? How is it actually used? How are administrators using it? How are teachers using it? When is it used? And what are the possible outcomes associated with these particular forms? So these are ways that we will support our districts at looking more closely at these particular policies. But again, relying on this notion that somewhere in there we had had the conversations already related to the beliefs, the core beliefs of CRE, which are equity, access, opportunity, fairness, and equality. So the next stage we will oftentimes engage with our school districts is also, so we have a student code of conduct, and we want to see how is the student code of conduct executing itself in practice. So part of this process will be is that we have folks actually begin to map out the school discipline process. So what that means is that, say, for example, if we have a student who is exhibiting a particular behavior and need, what happens during this stage? So we want to know what school policy and practice at each stage is informing what we do. So what that means is that at stage one, what are the school policies and practice that inform this stage? What are some of the critical questions that we're actually asking at this stage? And what are some of the possible outcomes that may actually occur at this particular stage? And so this is an example of a school discipline process that we've done with one district. And so this actually will lay out for a school and a school district what happens in the school discipline process based on the guideline that we provided, the student code of conduct. And it provides a picture, okay, so we have these guidelines. How are each individual school implementing the guidelines that we've actually provided? And so oftentimes there is variation in the ways that these guidelines are actually being implemented. That tends to be a red flag for districts, because the intention is that if we have a guideline that identifies what the school discipline process should be like, then to whatever degree we have discretion, but our schools should be implementing it similarly. We should see similar outcomes, which then oftentimes will lead us to these pieces. So when we begin to look a little bit more closer at what beliefs, policies, and practices are actually impacting the different aspects of disproportionality. At the beginning, what I did is I referred to it as the rainbow. That is the rainbow that had the multiple factors that contribute to disproportionality. And that included our discipline policies and practices, our interventions and referrals, instruction and assessment, educational opportunity, family community, teacher expectations, misconceptions, cultural dissonance, and social demographic factors. And so we have districts begin to map out. When they begin to look at school discipline policies and practices, what belief is guiding that discipline policy and practice? What policy is guiding it, and what practice is guiding it? So what this ultimately looks like when we begin to look at the example, what you will note, for this particular example, when we look at the discipline policies and practices, there are particular beliefs that are guiding this district's discipline policies and practices. And one of them is that there is a philosophy of punishment operating in the district, and that individuals in this district believe that discipline should actually be punitive and not corrective in nature. And so as such, people believe that unless we punish children, they're not going to learn. So the policy that we clearly see is guiding this is that the code of conduct is being used with considerable discretion. And the practice in there then really becomes is that administrators don't give out consequences subjectively. That is that there are the same consequences for different infractions. But in a similar light, the practices that play out in this particular district are out-of-school suspension and ISS. And when these consequences are actually implemented, there is a level of consistency that is occurring in the practice instead of a level of equity and fairness. And the practice within this particular district is actually zero tolerance practices. So we look at another one, for example, related to interventions and referrals. The belief that really guides the interventions and referrals in this particular district is that student misbehavior is supported rather than teachers. Referring teacher does have to handle the behavioral issue, and that the referring teacher cannot handle the student. So the underlying belief is that when we refer a student, is that there is a belief that our teachers are not able to handle the student. The policies that have been laid out, not as explicit, is that the referral policy really says that it does not necessarily have to lead to an automatic suspension, but also that intervention should have been in place prior to the referral. That is actually the guiding policy. Then the practice becomes that teachers refer students, but an administrator might just send back the students to the classroom, because the expectation really is that if there is a behavior issue that is occurring in the classroom that could be managed by the teacher, the expectation already is that the teacher should be handling that particular behavior. I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I'm cognizant of our time, and I want to make sure that we provide an opportunity for your questions to be addressed. What I want to highlight here further in thinking about the ways that cultural dissonance and social demographic belief, policies, and practices play out is this. So when we think about cultural dissonance, in this district, they believe that cultural differences make one beautiful and special, and that not all students can learn. So they're contradictory in nature. And the policy is that we're going to hold a multicultural day. And the practice is oftentimes that students who are different here are oftentimes ignored, and there is a clear alienation on cultural differences. For our social demographic beliefs is that we believe here in this district that social demographics do not play a part in students' ability to learn, and so as such, they should do well in school. A policy is that this policy should not be a factor in performance projections, but the practice is that race influences our expectations for our own student success and in school. So before we open it up for questions, I want to take this opportunity to actually thank the New York State Department of Education for the support and funds that they offer us to be able to do the work that we do. New Jersey Department of Education Executive County Superintendent for their collaboration in our work. Regional Educational Laboratory Mid-Atlantic for the collaboration and the ongoing support that they've provided for us as we continue to do our webinars. Our districts and schools that we work with, if we didn't have the districts and schools that we work with, we wouldn't be working with anybody. So we're grateful for them. Of course, our center and my taxi colleagues as well. I want to thank you for listening to this presentation today, but also I'm looking forward to the questions that you have.
Well, thank you again, Maria, and thank you to all the participants for your engagement throughout the session. We did notice some of the questions in the parking lot, and we'd like to take time to have Maria respond to those questions. I also want to point out that we did notice that you had questions that were submitted at the time of registration, so we took note of those as well. And if for some reason you feel that your question is not addressed or wasn't addressed during Maria's presentation, those of you who sent them ahead of time, please feel free to resubmit it. But we'll go ahead on and get started with a few of those questions. One comes from Deborah Jennings. She's wondering, how do beliefs, policies, and practices related to families and family engagement contribute to disproportionality? And I wanted to point out that Julia Morales also has a question that seems related, so I'm posting that as well. She wants to know if you have any suggestions as to how these conversations with parents to engage them to become part of the educational process for children and ultimately for their own success. They're both trying to figure out this family involvement piece and disproportionality.
I appreciate the question, and that is actually a great question. Often oftentimes the role that belief policies and practices play, specifically related to the ways that we engage families, in particular families, I want to be clear on that, is that sometimes we do have particular sets of beliefs already about our families who are different. And so those beliefs oftentimes really hinder our ability then to really support our families. And what I mean, the beliefs is that sometimes are those that, they don't want to be involved in their children's education, they don't care about their kids' education. And those are things I often will hear. But the reality becomes this, that all of our families are invested in our children's education. It just looks different. And so the role that a district and a school can play in creating policies and practices to specifically engage family but also community is through really shifting how we are currently doing family engagement. Because family engagement oftentimes, and I say family engagement is more interactive in nature. It's supposed to be more interactive in nature. It's supposed to be more responsive to what the family needs, rather when we think about parent engagement, that it is more about the school offering a plethora of different activities with the expectations that our parents come. The family engagement piece is really then about how is it that we begin to create policies that ensure that our families become partners in our children's education. So that's going to mean is that we're going to want to meet with our families, have focus groups with our families. At times, have to go visit our families in the communities our families live in. So yes, that means home visits. It also means that beyond PTA, that there is actually family representatives, parents representatives in our committees throughout the school, throughout our district. Because the reality is that if we're going to tackle disproportionality, we want to make sure that we're clear that our families are an asset. And what our families bring with them and to us is the most valuable thing that we're trying to garner to make sure that our kids are successful, because our kids come from our families already, and our families are really sending the best they got. So they didn't leave the baby, their best baby at home. They sent their best baby. So our heavy lift is really identifying ways where we step out of a box from the ways that we traditionally want to engage our families. And the way we traditionally engage our families is oftentimes we may hold an event. We may actually have parent-teacher conferences. We may oftentimes call families to come to school when there's something going on with their child. But the shift is really about how do our families become partners in this process. And to become partner in this process, our parents need to know that they're valued, that their voice is valued despite what their background is.
Okay, great. The next question comes from Robin Vanover, and she was really just asking about a resource. She says, do you have sample walkthrough guides or checklists to share when looking for culturally responsive environments?
Thank you for your question, Robin. Yes, we actually do. We've actually have created a culturally responsive walkthrough tool for building level, but also classroom level as well.
Okay, great. And then another question comes from Rebecca Paramati, and she's wondering if you could explain the difference between Stage 2 and Stage 3 on the discipline process form.
Yeah, absolutely. So what often times happens is at Stage 1, here a student is demonstrating an actual behavior. So this is a behavior I oftentimes will see in a classroom. Is a child is tapping their pen on the desk. There's a tap. And then with stage 2, what will oftentimes happen is, so once they see the behavior, and perhaps the student has been told, stop that behavior, stop tapping your pen, and student continues to tap their pen. So at this given point in time, is the teacher has actually written an actual referral that they want the administrator to actually consider for any prospective outcome. And what I mean prospective outcome is, do we need to call a parent, for example? Do we just need to talk to the student, for example?
Gotcha. Okay, so I just want to mention really quickly that to Maribeth and Cassandra, who are asking more questions about the walkthrough guides, we're going to look into getting them so that we can share them with you. We'll get them from Maria later. And I am going to post the next question, which comes from Tiffany Carter. And she wants to know about displaced students and how they figure into all of this and how do we get them back on track. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Could she clarify what she means with displaced students?
Tiffany, if you wouldn't mind, if you could just follow up in the parking lot box with some clarifying details about what you're thinking about with displaced. We're not sure if you're talking about a child who may be temporarily homeless or anything like that. So please follow up. And while you do that, we'll move on to Terry Medina's question that was posted
You want to know where the parking lot is?
I'm sorry, it's just in this area where you see the chatting going on, Tiffin. I'm sorry about that. So right where you posted your other question, you just posted there. But Terry J's question is about linguistic diversity and how that figures into this issue.
Thank you for your question, Terry. This fits in very well, actually. So oftentimes when we have our English language learners who are in the process of acquiring a second language, what tends to happen specifically when districts and schools haven't responded to the social demographic shift of a district where we begin to kind of see more ELLs in districts, an actual second language acquisition becomes more of a language disability. So what that translates into is that if we don't necessarily have a problem-solving team that will first address the academic support that a student needs who has linguistic needs, the route will be more towards special education. So that means that if I'm not acquiring a second language at the pace that I'm expected to, specifically when some of our practitioners might not necessarily understand how a second language is acquired, that means that rather than figuring out that this is really a second language acquisition, it becomes more of a disability, and then it becomes more of an actual referral to the child study team, and then it becomes testing, and then it becomes placement into special education. So some of the patterns we know with linguistically diverse students is that there's a propensity to classify them, but also classifying specifically in speech and language impairments at a disproportionate rate.
So Tiffany clarified her question a little bit. What she is wanting you to speak to is those students who might be who might have behavioral issues but are on target academically, and I guess she's trying to figure out, what are some things that we can do to ensure their success so that they don't become, I guess, disproportionality statistics.
Thank you, Tiffin. Part of this is I say, it's that kind of interaction between academics and behavior. And so when we have children who are academically succeeding, we have to consider what the antecedents are of that particular behavior for our actual students. And what I mean with that is that sometimes our kids who are succeeding academically, they actually may need more. More being is that they've already learned what they needed to do in a classroom setting, that they need greater challenge. They're the student who's got the material down, but what they actually need is something that will challenge them further. And it's all dependent upon what the behavior is too, right? So are we talking about behavior that could prospectively be a little bit more disruptive in nature? Are we talking about behavior where a student is walking out of class? So it becomes important for us to then really look a little bit closer at the antecedent of the actual behavior. So then as such, we're able to identify what is actually causing the behavior for our students, and then as such, what intervention do we have to put in place to support our students. But if it is an actual more piece where our students are bored out of their mind, it's going to play out in particular behavior. So then it really speaks more to how are we really targeting instruction differently, how are we differentiating instruction for different levels of our children.
And so the next question is from Sharon Wells and Taylor Alston. They had a variation of the same question. They're wondering what resources can their partner schools use to help school leaders and their staff demystify the biases that impact student outcomes. So clarity on some of those biases, I suppose.
It's a conversation. It's a hard conversation to have with colleagues. Leaders even struggle with having the conversation. And what oftentimes some will do is as basic as this. They'll begin to talk about the data. And in having the conversation about the data, they'll put it out to faculty and staff and say, what data patterns do you actually notice here? And further, why do we see these particular data patterns? Why are particular children being impacted by these particular data patterns more than other children? So I'd say that's the easy route. Differences, it prospectively opens the conversation about biases. And what's amazing to me within even those conversations is that the biases kind of come out. And what I mean with that is that part of those biases that come out is like, well, those children, and that's the language that I don't use this language, but that's the language. If those children would work harder, if their parents were more involved in their education, if they did this, without really taking a moment to say, okay, well, how am I contributing to this? In what way do I contribute as well? So as such, there's numerous ways to get engaged in the conversation, and the heavy lifting is really assessing where is our school at in being ready to have a conversation. So if our school is at a point where we're going to have many people be upset, then we start with the data piece. But if our school is at a different point, we're honest and we say, you know what, we see some differences here, and this is how these differences are actually playing out. So let's talk about why these differences are actually happening. Another way to approach it is starting out with book clubs, having individuals read a chapter on a particular book that highlights disproportionality, that highlights race, that highlights conversations about beliefs. And I say conversations about beliefs because conversations about beliefs are multi-layered, and those rely on oftentimes deficit thinking. They rely on meritocracy. They rely on color blindness. They rely on cultural or context neutral ideals. And that is more specific because we're more comfortable thinking that we're color blind, because if we say that we see color, then there's a chance that someone might actually call us a racist. And so we can engage in those conversations sometimes by just providing a reading on what this is and have people really chart it out, think about it. But without the conversation, we can't address the biases.
Okay, and I'm going to post the question from Paula Robinson. She is wondering about the link between addressing disproportionality and improved attendance. I guess she's wondering if there's any research, around that. So if you could speak to that.
Thank you, Paula. Absolutely. There is a clear link between disproportionality and attendance. So disproportionality oftentimes excludes particular children. And so when our children are oftentimes, specifically our Black and Latino children, are oftentimes touched by the disciplinary system more frequently, it has a clear impact on attendance. And so that over time, what tends to happen for our Black and Latino students is that the exclusion from the educational experience will then oftentimes lead to more serious outcomes. So what I mean with that, at some point, our students become excluded, they become disenfranchised from the educational process. Then we begin to see consistent decreases in attendance rates. Then we begin to see consistent disengagement of our students in school. And then we begin to see disparate underachievement and then dropout of our children. So there is a clear connection because they intersect, they clearly intersect with each other. And what I want to highlight here is that sometimes when we begin to ask districts to look at their ABCs in their data disaggregatedly, is what districts will note is that attendance, behavior, and academics are correlated with each other for particular students. As such, when you understand those intersections, then you're able to figure out what decisions are we going to make for our students who are struggling with attendance, are struggling behaviorally, and are struggling academically. What do we have in place for them? What interventions do we actually need to have in place for our kids who are actually struggling the most so we could remedy the disproportionate outcome?
Great. Well, we're going to have to close our question and answer period now as we are running out of time. But I want to thank everyone for your great questions and for your engagement during the period. Any unanswered questions that you still have, we're going to provide you with Maria's contact information. You can certainly follow up with her. And now I'm going to turn things over to Laura, who will bring us closer to closure.
Okay. Heather, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, perfect, perfect. All right, we certainly thank everyone for participating in today's, I am going to say, stimulating conversation. Dr. Hernandez did an amazing job, not only in terms of offering and presenting information and promoting thinking and reflection, but based on the set of questions that were being generated, it is also quite telling in terms of how much you are gaining from these presentations and how deeply you are thinking about the next steps that must be taken back at your district or school level or agency that you might be representing. We certainly look forward to your future participation, and I can only reiterate the fact that as you plan professional learning opportunities for your staff at the school and district levels, you are going to utilize these amazing resources to certainly guide and support the work that you are trying to do. And just as a reminder, you will receive an email with all of the resources that were used and that were referenced not only during webinar 1, and some of you may have missed it, and certainly from today's webinar as well. And also, at this particular time, what I would say is that this is certainly a great opportunity for you to begin looking at your calendar and certainly marking March 8th as well as March 22nd when the next two sessions will be presented. What a wonderful way to continue in the conversation with you, and I certainly thank everyone involved, particularly REL, as well as NYU for their support. So with that, I certainly thank you once again, and I hope you will have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. Heather?
Yes. I just want to advance the site really quickly just to remind everyone that we'd really be interested in knowing if today's session met your needs. From the feedback in the parking lot, it certainly looks like it. We want any suggestions you might have for us to better serve you, so please provide us with your feedback when prompted to do so. Once again, we'd like to just thank all of our session participants and our presenter, Dr. Maria Hernandez. Thank you. Have a really great day, a great weekend, and we hope you'll join us in the next webinar for the next webinar in our series. Bye, everyone.